Hey kiddos, so today we're going to start talking about the Italian Renaissance. This was really sort of our beginning point of AP Euro this year, starting in that sort of like 1400s era. Specifically today we're going to talk about the rise of humanism. We've got a lot to do, so let's dive right in and get to it. So first off, we want to talk a little bit about what factors are driving this idea of humanism. And don't worry, we're going to talk a lot more about what humanism is and the themes of it at the end of the video, just to sort of recap. But what's driving this switch to humanism? Well, the first part of it is that, as with many things in history, there's a reaction to the thing before it. And so while humanism is sort of a philosophical point of view, the point of view that was prior to it was scholasticism, which isn't necessarily a philosophical point of view, more like sort of a method of learning. But the point was that it was very sort of rigid, and it like had these sort of very clearly determined like what things you were allowed to study and in what ways you were supposed to talk about them. And it was very rigid. And so as we move out of the Middle Ages into our sort of more modern times here, into the Renaissance time in particular, there's a real reaction against that idea. And maybe there are different ways to learn. Maybe we don't have to learn just so that I can become a priest or just so that I can become a lawyer. Maybe there's some value in learning all sorts of other things as well. What is going to aid in this is that if you, of course, know your ancient history or know even the beginnings of the history that we're talking about, is that the Byzantine Empire is going to fall in 1453, and a lot of scholars who have texts and access to texts and a lot of knowledge from Greek and classical periods are going to come to the West, come to Italy and the cities of Italy in particular, and that's going to lead to a flourishing of that sort of scholarship. The first real person that sort of jumps in here as the real bearer of the idea of humanism is going to be Petrarch. Petrarch is often called the father of humanism. If you look at the time frame for Petrarch, this really is sort of before our time that we're talking about in the 1450s. But he's the guy that sort of gets the ball rolling, and everyone else is sort of going to build off of that. What Petrarch is known for, he's really known for poetry. If you see this painting here, he's writing poems to a woman named Laura. And one of those sort of classic cases of unrequited love. And it's almost very similar to Dante and his love for Beatrice, if you know anything about Dante's Divine Comedy. The irony, of course, is that Petrarch is sort of very judgmental, and that he thinks that Dante is a medieval. In fact, Petrarch is really the guy that gets the idea of the Middle Ages being the Dark Ages sort of like out into the greater world, because he definitely refers to the Middle Ages as a dark time, and then later scholars are going to sort of pick up on that, and they're going to call those things the Dark Ages. So what does Petrarch specifically do to advance the cause of humanism? Well, specifically, he really loves classical Latin works, and he really especially loves Cicero, and to a lesser degree St. Augustine as well. And so he sort of takes those as a model, but he doesn't take them as a model and then do everything in Latin. And this is where he sort of really gets a lot of his cred as a humanist, is he doesn't write everything in Latin. He actually writes everything in the vernacular. He's going to write things in Italian. And to go along with his poetry, what really makes him a real humanist is the idea that he's going to talk about and write poems about really strong and powerful emotions, and for their own sake, not because he's trying to like convince someone of his point of view or anything like that, just because he believed that emotions and that emotionality was something that was worthy of celebrating in and of itself. And that is definitely a hallmark of humanism writ large. The next guy that we want to talk about is Lorenzo Valla. Valla is really famous because what he does, he's actually a Catholic priest, but he really sort of introduces the world to the idea of textual analysis. And what that means is that he's examining the text and comparing it to other texts and comparing it to what they know about certain eras of history. And essentially what he does is he takes this really famous thing called the donation of Constantine, which basically was the idea that the Emperor Constantine had left all of the papal lands to the Pope. And he basically says that there's no way that Constantine did this, that this was a document that was made much later than Constantine's era, probably maybe in the 8th century, as opposed to the 4th century, which would have been when Constantine could have done it. And so he declares it a forgery. And this is kind of a big deal because he's a Catholic priest, but he's essentially saying that the Pope doesn't really have what was thought to be his legal right to the papal land. So as you might imagine, Pope doesn't really care for that. Now, there's a sort of a side story there, is that Valla is sort of being his patron is a noble who is sort of against the Pope as well. But that textual analysis that he did really holds up really well. He's also going to spend a lot of his time condemning indulgences. And this is going to sort of lead many to say that he's sort of a forerunner to Luther, to Martin Luther, that we'll see later on. Our next person is really important, and I think, you know, maybe doesn't get all the pub that maybe he necessarily deserves. Pico della Mirandola, he writes something called the Oration of the Dignity of Man. And this is really like considered by many to be like the manifesto of the Renaissance. It essentially lays out the ideas that what the Renaissance is really about in art and architecture and thought and all of those things is the uniqueness and worth of individual people. And let me read you just a little quote from that, just so you sort of get a little flavor of what's going on. Philosophy has taught me to rely on my own convictions rather than the judgment of others, and to concern myself less with whether or not I am well thought of than whether or not I do or say what I do or say is evil. And so you can really get a real flavor there for the idea of what the Renaissance humanists were really about. They're really concerned with the individual and talking about their own emotions and thoughts instead of, hey, what does the church tell us that we can do? What does my noble say that I'm allowed to say and do? And so that's a real big, you know, shift. It's a paradigm shift from sort of the Middle Ages that were largely church reliant to a much more uniqueness and worth of individuals. In fact, what we'll see later is that a lot of later scholars or a lot of later folks in the church will get really mad at people like Mirandola because they'll say that the focus on the individual is really taking away from the focus on community, which is what we really need. Castiglione writes a book called the Book of the Courtier, or the Courtier, and the courtier is basically someone who is someone that's around the noble, in the noble courts. And what he lays out is essentially like just a template for what the Renaissance man should be, both in the way that he should behave and what he should be in general. So what does Castiglione say? He says that it should be someone who's a worthy friend, a worthy man, that he's got good friends. He says that he should be good at a wide variety of things. That's kind of what Renaissance man means. He should be good at dancing and at poetry. He should be able to draw. He should be able to talk about literature. He should be able to write literature. He should be able to write and all of those things. And perhaps most importantly, he should be able to do all of those things and make it look very graceful and natural, like as if he's not really trying at all, that it's just sort of naturally flowing from him. The word the Italian word for that would be sprezzatura. And my Italian, of course, is non-existent, so I'm sorry if that sounded terrible. So Castiglione lays out the groundwork for, like, hey, if you want to be a true Renaissance man or a true humanist, one might say, these are the things that you ought to be. You ought to be what we might today call a polymath. You should be good at all things. Of course, Machiavelli is like a giant as far as the Renaissance goes. Almost every AP Euro class, you guys are probably going to study the Prince, and so I'm not going to go too deep into that. But I'd be remiss if I didn't just sort of throw this in here. Machiavelli, of course, wrote The Prince. It was sort of like this is a how-to guide for despots and leaders. And of course, what he is really famous for is the idea of the ends justify the means. In other words, if your end is to create a stable state where your people have peace and they can trade and live their lives without fear of like bandits and things like that, that whatever the ruler has to do to make that happen, that is entirely justified. And of course, Machiavelli takes this really cynical tack. He talks about how it's better to be feared than loved. At least that's what he does particularly in The Prince. Now, he also wrote the Discourses, which I think a lot of classes sort of leave out. I think his views in there are a little bit more tempered, probably a little bit more towards the representative government than into the authoritarian government that maybe The Prince sort of seemed to be going along with. Anyway, hopefully there'll be a whole nother video on Machiavelli and The Prince at some point in the future. A couple other really good exemplars of Renaissance thought, and we're not going to go too deep into these guys, but I think you should at least recognize the names and maybe be able to pull them in, or if you get a writing sample as you're taking the test, and you need to, you'll be able to recognize those. Giorsadini, he wrote the history of Italy. He was a friend and opponent of Machiavelli. He really gets a lot of credit because he writes this really long history of the Italian city-states and sort of some of the wars that they're going through that he lived through. And so it really gave a really good example for future historians sort of how they should set things up. The idea of historiography really comes out of a lot of what he's doing. Bruni, he gets a lot of credit because he's another historian, but he gets a lot of credit because he's sort of the first guy to divide history up in the way that we sort of divide history up today. He says there's antiquity, okay, so the Greeks and Romans, and then there's the Middle Ages, everything after the Roman Empire collapsed, and then there's what we would call modern times. Now, he divided them up a little bit differently, but that's sort of the same basic three ways that we divide them up today. And then Battista Alberti, he is probably like the foremost real exemplar of what a Renaissance man was at the time. And of course, we're going to talk later about the artists and Da Vinci and those guys who maybe are even better examples. But Alberti at the time, even, he was recognized as like, this is the guy. He was an artist. He studied math. He did a lot of mathematical proofs and published things on math. He was an architect. Hopefully when we do the art stuff, we'll be able to see some of his stuff. He was an author, a philosopher. He just was well known for being super well-rounded and good at everything. And that's the idea of what a Renaissance man was, that he put time and effort into all areas that he loved learning. That brings us to then, what are like really the themes of humanism? What were all these humanists really doing? Well, first off, they really believed strongly in the teaching of humanities, what at the time and even now we would call liberal arts. So not just talking about like, hey, you're going to school so that you can get a specific profession, like you're training in theology so you can be a priest, or you're training so that you can be a lawyer. No, it was more like, hey, learning is valuable for learning's sake itself. And so you go, you have a tutor, you go to school, or you go to the university so that you can be trained in all of these things so that you can be a Renaissance man. Of course, one of the main themes is the idea of the revival of classical Greek and Roman texts. For a long time throughout a lot of the Middle Ages, some of these things were lost, and as those scholars came over from Byzantium, they're going to bring a lot more of them in. And not just a revival like in the hey, they're more available, but really part of the humanist sort of tradition is to take pleasure in collecting those things and understanding them, and maybe even imitating them in some way. And we'll see that a lot in the art of the Renaissance as well. The idea was to be a Renaissance man. We talked about that, the ability to excel in a lot of areas, not just one. Really, of course, where does it get the name humanist? It gets the name humanist because they're interested in human subjects rather than simply sort of, before this time, a lot of scholarship was sort of very much focused on the church and theology. And of course, if you can focus on a lot more areas, if you can focus on emotion and stuff like that, you're focused on human subjects, and that's what makes you a humanist. I want to throw in there at the end that almost all of these humanists, though, they were still very religious folks. In fact, many of them were priests themselves. So the idea that we sort of have today that like, hey, the Renaissance is where secular thought starts, I think that is accurate. But the idea that somehow it should be separate from religion, I think that almost to a man, these humanists really would have like sort of recoiled from that idea. They very much did not think that their focus on human issues was in any way taking away from their love of God or their theological pursuits, really. All right, I hope that's a good start for us to dive into the topics of AP Europe. And coming up, we'll have some videos about art and architecture and all of those things as well. Thanks a lot.